Welcome to the Navig Institute lecture series on the First World War. I'm Anthony Mutton, is the Associate Director of the Institute. If you were here last time, Professor Van Lindley gave a nice talk on causes of the First World War and ranged widely over those kinds of questions. Next time on November 5th, we're going to have our own John Dayak, also from Notre Dame, talking about the role of the Habsburg Empire, reconsidering various aspects of that Habsburg Empire. But today we have a real special treat because Tait Keller from Rhodes College in Tennessee is here to talk to us about the First World War and environmental history, which is not something that has been taken up extensively before, and Tait is writing a book on the subject, so let me he'll tell you more about that in a second. Again, he's from Rhodes College in Tennessee, assistant professor and director of environmental studies and sciences. He earned his BA at the University of Rochester and his MA in German and European Studies and his PhD in history from Georgetown, but we won't hold that against him. He completed his first book, Apostles of the Alps, Mountaineering Nature and Nationhood in Germany and Austria, forthcoming from University of North Carolina Press. That book focuses on German and Austrian mountain clubs and their role in the fashioning of identity in those regions. At a very interesting time, and in a very interesting way, that they helped to transform the landscape, or were transformed by the landscape, and were involved in numerous kinds of issues having to do with the construction of ethnic and political identity. The next book, though, is a global history, I want to get this title right, a global environmental history of the First World War, which is now under contract with Cambridge University Press. And this kind of work, we think, really nicely balances old traditional historical methods with some pretty new, innovative, and interdisciplinary questions. He's given lectures at the Bavarian Academy of Science, the Austrian Center for Environmental History, and of course the National World War I Memorial Museum. He teaches a range of courses in this area. Several of them transcend consideration of any single country. And that's language that we're very familiar with at the Navig Institute. Our Shannon Prize in European Studies also focuses on these kinds of, this kind of ambition to talk more generally, to construct larger narratives about Europe itself. His pedagogy is also grounded in the empirical. I'm told that, true to Rhodes College and its tradition of community outreach and applied learning, Tait gets his students out into the real world to explore what they're studying, to the point of paddling Voyager canoes, modeled on what French explorers once used down the lower Mississippi. So having come from Louisiana, there myself, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, did you get past the control structures?
Not quite, we didn't make it.
Okay, well, all of the issues of the intersection of even military and environmental history are very pertinent to all the issues in Louisiana, so we know that well. So take us down this new river of environmental impact of the First World War and making of the 20th century. Please welcome Tait Keller.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining me here today. I want to especially thank the Institute for inviting me. This is my first time to Notre Dame, and I came on the perfect day. They're all like this, aren't they? These sunny blue skies. I'm going to talk about militarized environments of the First World War with an eye towards what comes later in the 20th century. And I'm going to start us off talking about a German artillery officer who was also a psychologist. His name was Kurt Leuven. And in his writing while convalescing from battle wounds in 1917, he talked about battlefields. And during his time on the Western Front, he observed that soldiers experienced a peculiar perception of landscapes. He argued that those in harm's way saw space differently from civilians living in safety. He called them peace landscapes. Peace landscapes appeared round and boundless, extending as far out as the eye could see. War landscapes, on the other hand, like we get a sense here from this backdrop, were directed, contained, bordered by violence and destruction. Terrain within the danger zone, he argued, acquired new meaning, new military meaning that matched the intensity of combat. And he used the example of a forest, like we see here is a forest on the Western Front. And for him, the edge of the forest gained exaggerated meaning during battle. And with the cessation of hostilities, the meaning of the forest's edge changed, it no longer signified a fighting front. So Levin drew a fine cerebral line for us between war landscapes and peace landscapes, the mental constructs that soldiers placed on the material world indicated for them the boundaries of belligerency. Now, from a psychological point of view, Levin's analysis seemed fitting enough, given his own experience in France and our contemporary understanding of post-traumatic stress disorder, what doctors during the First World War called shell shock. Soldiers under fire endured horrors that those behind the lines struggled to comprehend. But many civilians lived in danger zones as well, especially vulnerable populations near the fighting fronts, particularly minorities in the Ottoman and Russian empires. So where violence engulfed the home front, the distinction between war landscapes and peace landscapes becomes blurred. I'll argue that from an ecological perspective, that distinction disappears entirely. Borders between war landscapes and peace landscapes overlap or vanish. Now, as soon as I say Western Front, I'm sure certain images will come to mind, these typical French images, these typical war images like we see here, soldiers battling with mud, the kind of environmental destruction that takes place. Here we see an aerial photograph, if you can sort of see, an aerial photograph of the Western Front with all those shell holes. So with these images, sort of our iconic visions of the conflict, I think we've tended to take for granted the place and role of nature. Historians have typically regarded the environment as the backdrop for battle or as collateral damage if we've taken consideration of the natural world at all. This, I think, is the paradox of an environment in times of war, that nature is both omnipresent and invisible. But I think that only by taking the environment into account can we really understand the trauma of this war and how this conflict shaped the most basic levels of human existence for years afterwards. And I would even go so far to say that while battlegrounds certainly suffered from the storms of steel like we see here, the resulting distortions of nature were short-lived. Longer-term environmental change occurred behind the lines, away from the killing fields. So the war made itself felt in other ways in other places besides artillery barrages in France and Belgium. So that's what I'll take you on today, is a little tour around the world. I'll start us off looking at what sort of changes were happening there on the Western Front, and other changes then that were taking place in Africa, in Asia, and in Latin America. It seems to me that this war needs a global history. I've always kind of wondered what made the First World War a world war. And so an environmental approach is one way for us to trace what sort of transformations were taking place around the world. So I'll first give you some parameters. When I proposed a global environmental study of the war, I saw that there's none out there. No one has written a global environmental study approach, probably because no one is so foolish as to try to do that. But here I am before you. So I'm going to attempt this ambitious project. I'm at the start of it, so if you have questions or comments afterwards, I'd be happy to hear them. What I'm going to examine is how countries extract, consume, and expel energy. That's going to be my focus, is on energy, what we would call a country's energy regime. And I concentrate on foodstuff for soldiers, for beasts of burden, and fuels, fossil fuels to keep those machines running, sources of energy that enable bodies and machines to function. And I think that the duration and the scale of this conflict altered the arrangement, the size, the orientation of energy regimes around the world. And it led to new flows of biomass, of fossil fuels, that revolutionized how states managed their natural resources, something that set a trajectory then for the rest of the 20th century. Now, let me first talk to you about the Western Front. Here we have a typical scene of utter devastation, these ruined landscapes pitted and cracked with craters and trenches, and these, for contemporaries, quickly became a metaphor for the Great War's waste. But I would suggest to us that we need to be careful on how we interpret contemporary descriptions of desolation. The war's impact on the land, like we see here, certainly horrified university-educated soldiers who in a lot of ways were groomed in the romantic appreciation of nature. But then we might wonder just how appalling was this environment to those who labored in mines or emptied cesspools, bathed in polluted rivers, or slept in slums. Was the war's onslaught against nature something so different from what industrialization had wrought in the years leading up to 1914? Now, hostilities disrupted ecologies on battlefields everywhere, but nowhere was the concentration of forces so great as on the Western Front. It was large projectiles that did most of the damage. In the heat of battle, artillery units fired several hundred rounds an hour. And although their range barely extended beyond about 20 kilometers or so, the guns obliterated everything within reach, like we see here. And so literate, educated soldiers depicted these sorts of landscapes through a common set of tropes. They repeatedly used adjectives like dark, ravaged, dreary, savage, eerie, barren, devastated, hideously scarred. Some described the surroundings as a landscape that had lost its nature, had turned into something artificial. But I would suggest that these are not new sentiments. When soldiers remarked that the sights and the smells of the Western Front reminded them of a factory, they tapped into 19th century critiques of industrial development. Observers of industrialization's ills had spoken the same language a generation earlier. If you were to read Friedrich Engel's book about the working class in England and working conditions there, you see that he discussed neighborhoods in terms that soldiers later applied to the trenches. So by borrowing the idioms of the previous generations, the war's chroniclers placed this conflict in line with industrial capitalism's environmental costs. And so this degradation on the Western Front, like we see here, represented those developments in their most violent, concentrated form. But the thing of it is there were multiple views of the front, and we see that if we were there in the trenches, we would be offered not only vistas of ruin, but that of nature's resilience. The Western Front environment, in a way, exemplified contradiction. The landscape appeared simultaneously gruesome, scarred with these splintered trees and churned up metals, meddled with human gore, but they could also be pleasant, covered in bright green grass, full of colorful flowers and thriving wildlife. So for soldiers, the experience could be both jarring and comforting. I think perhaps the most shocking incongruity for soldiers was how quickly these devastated lands appeared to recover after the war. Some veteran associations in 1920 found that nature acted too soon. They would send letters to the French government complaining that the dense shrubbery prevented them from touring their former posts. So the landscape's swift rehabilitation begs the question of just how destructive was the war on the ecosystem. So maybe a better approach is for us to ask the degree to which the Great War transformed the environment. Ecosystems evolve and change on their own. War often makes that change more drastic, more sudden, and might direct natural succession in unexpected ways. So for the Western Front, then, we can sum it up that the war altered the makeup of forests and the composition of soil. Prior to the war, prior to 1914, the majority of forests along the Western Front were deciduous, comprising European beech, like you see here, European hornbeam, European oak, English oak. After the war, authorities planted the obliterated sections with Austrian pine and Scots pine, like you see here. These were a fast-growing coniferous species, and they tended to tolerate nutrient-poor soil. There was also the sense that these trees would lend a different feeling of sanctuary and reverence to places that once hosted mass killings. Less visible were changes to soil composition. Like natural events such as earthquakes and windstorms, war brought about major soil disturbance. So it was a powerful agent. Warfare is a powerful agent of geomorphic change. So battles turned stable ecosystems into loose, unconsolidated sediment. But over the years, we find that much of that has been assimilated back into the soil profile, largely because of really industrious earthworms. So today, if we were to tour the front, we'd see visions like this, landscapes that look like this, where even though there are shells still embedded in this soil, you can see a little sense of it right there, this place has largely recovered. Flora and fauna thrive here. It's behind the lines that I think we can see greater, more sustained changes. Armies are often studied as social entities, but we can think of them as biological entities as well, which depend on a military ecology of energy extraction, production, and supply. So to maintain the biological welfare of soldiers, and to keep engines in actions, militaries commandeered food and fuel throughout the biosphere. And so I'll hop skipping around for you, take you to a couple places where we can see that. The first place I'll take you to is Africa. Most histories of the First World War focus on German East Africa, where both sides carried out their campaigns on the backs of Africans. In 1914, Equatorial Africa had very few roads, few railways, and although the war increased infrastructure throughout this region, especially up towards here and down here towards Portuguese territory, development proceeded pretty slowly. What was at issue was the tsetse fly. There you see it up there. The tsetse fly is the biological vector that spreads sleeping sickness that would attack pack animals in particular, by the thousands. These pack animals would fall prey to the tsetse fly by the thousands. So European troops relied on African laborers to haul supplies. And this is a typical picture that gives you an idea of that. The British recruited over 1 million porters, often it was forced recruitment, drawn from populations across sub-Saharan Africa, and that's important for us. Pursuing the Germans, it was really guerrilla warfare style that we find happening here in East Africa, this daring and dashing German commander who would strike the British and then retreat into the bush. And in their pursuit, the British required at least 2 or 3 African carriers for every British soldier. And in fact, European officers viewed their African recruits as a tactical advantage, thinking that people who were raised in this environment were better suited to fight and deal in it. But as we look at death rates, we find that death rates among African recruits over the course of the war soared to over 20%, which is much higher than for British soldiers. One explanation for this disparity is food shortages. By 1917, most of these African laborers received less than 1,000 calories a day. But the crucial factor here was that the vast majority of African conscripts came from different locales with different disease environments. So what we find is that population displacement, massive population displacement that we get here with this war, also meant ecological dislocation. So whatever resistance that porters had to their local pests or local pathogens proved ineffective when they were in foreign, malarial, or tsetse lands. Since they were not getting enough food, malnutrition and sheer physical exhaustion often left them even more vulnerable to disease. What we find here during the war is a spread of these diseases throughout Africa, especially with the tsetse fly. If I take you back to this map, attempts to evade forced conscription compelled people to enter tsetse territory, the bush where they would normally avoid. European forces also would seize cattle in order to feed the troops. So cattle seizures likewise created a negative feedback loop of tsetse expansion. Cattle grazing would clear the bush to make pasture land. This would push back the tsetse boundaries. But when you take those cattle, when cattle are seized, the bush recovers, tsetse spread. There's another correlation we can draw here. With the reduction of livestock, Those cattle had been easy prey, especially for old and lazy lions. So what we find happening during this war is also an increase in animal attacks on humans, which means that people begin then deserting villages for safer places, more urban places, which meant land around those villages begins to recover, the bush recovers, tsetse numbers swell. The war environment helped spread ancient diseases like sleeping sickness. It might also have created the condition for the emergence of new diseases. Food shortages plagued most of the African continent during the war. Hostilities disrupted international supply networks, redirected food towards armies. All these hungry soldiers are outstripping local supply, and there's soaring food prices. To make matters worse, in Africa, colonial governments restricted the sale of firearms and ammunitions, which left wild animals to run rampant through rice plantations, for example. And besides that, conscription had taken most of the hunters away anyway. These famine conditions drove people into the bush looking for new food sources. Many of them turned to chimpanzees for food. So the war intensified contact between humans and simians. And although the two share a pretty long history, the war exposed more people to more apes to an unprecedented degree. The time and place here are significant. Scientists have dated the emergence of HIV-1M, the pandemic form of the human immunodeficiency virus, somewhere between 1910 and 1930, and they trace its origins here to this corner of Cameroon. Most scientists believe that HIV was a zoonotic transmission, probably occurred with exposure to infected ape blood, likely during bushmeat hunting, when someone was there butchering the chimpanzee. There was indeed fighting that was happening here during the First World War. There were also severe conditions driving people into the bush, hunting chimpanzee. Did the First World War trigger the global HIV pandemic? The coincidences seem compelling enough. We might speculate that the index case were desperate civilians hiding in the bush, living off chimpanzee meat, who later migrated down to Leopoldville, where the HIV evolved and spread. The war had also increased blood transfusions, which together with aggressive vaccination campaigns in the colonies mingles people's blood. Perhaps that accelerated the virus's evolution into the disease that threatens us today. Maybe. We have to be careful not to overstate it. It's pretty hard to pinpoint at that precise moment when HIV emerged. Nevertheless, thinking about it illuminates the ways in which belligerence and environmental change went hand in hand and affected both soldiers and civilians here on the periphery of the war. If I hop across to another place, to Southeast Asia, maritime Southeast Asia didn't see armies clashing like we found in Africa, but it did include this important Strait of Malacca. This is one of the most important shipping lanes in the world. It connected the Indian Ocean to the Pacific. And it was so very important because Malayan tin exports were crucial to European industrial economies, which were dependent on tin, especially Great Britain's. Steel production, factory machines with moving parts relied heavily on tin. Its malleability made it easy to use. Since tin doesn't oxidize in the air and bonds readily with iron, it's often used as a coat to prevent corrosives. It's got anti-friction properties, so it's used on a lot of moving parts like crankshafts, for example, axles. It also has pretty low toxicity, so it's used in food packaging, right? Meat tins. And the Malay Peninsula, here you see right there, was the world's largest single tin producer, 50% of which came out of the Federated Malay States. Those were largely under British control. But in 1900, at the turn of the 20th century, European mines, mostly British mines, contributed only 10% of the total tin output. It was Chinese firms that dominated the industry, and most of those operations followed the labor-intensive model of open cast mining like you see here. So unable to compete with Chinese mines on the labor market, European firms turned to technology. And they started employing power-operated water pumps for hydraulic sluicing. Think of it as like big water cannons. They would, that's a terrible picture, I know. That's a water cannon. You have to imagine it a little bit. Yeah, spraying this pressurized water that would blast this tin-bearing earth and turn it into this sludgy mixture, and from that they would extract the tin. These mines were often located on hillsides. That's how they got the water pressure. Tin mining is a messy business, and that was especially true, you can imagine, for hydraulic sluicing. It would clear-cut forests on the hillsides to access water. The drainage from these pumps caused extensive soil erosion. Resulting landscapes would smother the lowlands, covering arable land with debris and grit, often pushing local farmers onto marginal lands. The sluicing runoff would choke rivers with sand and clay. So for nearby residents who depended on the rivers for navigation or fishing or for clean drinking water, tin mining pollution ruined livelihoods. Environmental conditions became so bad that local authorities attempted to require mining companies, European mining companies, to build dams or somehow manage their tin waste runoff. But there's an asymmetrical power relationship here between the European owners and the Malayan locals, which meant that tin extraction continued with few restraints. As you can imagine, the war further intensified mining operations. So the war's detrimental impact on the Malayan people environment was largely indirect when compared to what the Africans suffered, but intensified metal ore mining for these industrial armies turned the peninsula's hills and valleys into war landscapes all the same. It may very well be that every artillery barrage on the Western Front involved tin alloys from Southeast Asia. And in many ways, the mining scars on Malaya have lasted longer than the trenches in France. We find these scars elsewhere. The crucial energy resource was food. Food security was a defining feature of this war. Both sides faced dilemmas of feeding troops and civilians, along with countless beasts of burdens. But food was, in a lot of ways, more difficult than weapons to mobilize. Most farming at this time was small scale. Few nations were self-sufficient in agriculture. And so what we find are these massive propaganda campaigns to mobilize food. Here's a German one. This one's fantastic. Just hold out. This is about the German people, though they're surrounded, will mobilize to the last potato. It might be me, but I see a strange kind of face here. I don't know, potatoes and Germans. So we see there's an example. It's same true with the British enlisting chickens for the war. Potatoes weren't only for the Germans. Here we have, this is American propaganda poster. This is, you might not be able to see it, this is General Potato riding to war. It's supposed to be reminiscent of Paul Revere. This was especially true in countries that were blockaded by the British or the French navies that required authoritarian regimes to manage food resources. But regulations often proved ineffective in the face of disaster. For example, in 1915, a locust plague of biblical proportions exacerbated famine conditions in greater Syria. Here we see that picture, all those little black dots, those are locusts. These voracious insects stripped vineyards, croplands, orchards. Food markets were bare. It tells us the extent of this, that there wasn't even enough olive oil to light the temples in Jerusalem. Here we see a before and after shot. There's an olive tree before, olive tree after the locusts. People actually resorted to eating roasted locusts, by all accounts. Not that bad, a little salt. And burning. They would then burn the husks to heat home ovens. In the United States, we see efforts to deal with this, but instead of food rationing, like countries in Europe, the head U.S. Food Administrator, Herbert Hoover, encouraged citizens to eat less. And he would use the slogans like this: food will win the war, and they would have these propaganda posters attempting to change people's consumption habit. He called upon patriotic Americans to participate in meatless Mondays, they would have, or wheatless Wednesdays. I don't know, they liked alliteration. Oh, but it worked. It worked. It resulted in a 15% reduction in domestic food consumption. We see other attempts to change consumption patterns, encouraging people to preserve more. So here's a propaganda piece talking about collecting the fruit from your trees. Here you see this is Mrs. Patriot's fruit tree, right? The U.S. preserves. And in the back, might be kind of hard to see, that's Mrs. Waster's fruit tree. Or on how people prepared their food. Fats are fuel for fighters. So getting people to broil or fry less. We also have encouragement. There's a number of pamphlets that was circulated in the U.S. at this time, encouraging people to try drying their food as to preserve it. So we see a number of instances providing recipes, for example, like this delectable dish of dried carrots that you can enjoy during the war. It's useful for us to note this because the war certainly expanded patterns of exploiting nature, but it also set standards for conservation efforts. Nevertheless, the incentives for mass production were large. On the eve of the war, it was the Russian Empire that was the leading wheat exporter. This was the mainstay carbohydrate for most European countries. But when the Ottomans entered the war, they blocked the Russian supplies from reaching Europe, so Europe then turned to North America as its breadbasket. And the economic incentives for expanding cultivation were abundant, especially here along the Great Plains. And even though this is just the U.S., this was true for the Canadian prairies as well. There were artificially high wheat prices that were put in place by the government. This created the incentive for bonanza farms in the United States. Optimistic farmers would borrow heavily, usually through second mortgages, to expand cultivation on marginal lands. In some counties there in the Midwest, that increase in wheat acreages was upwards of 200%, 400%. In some places, it was 1,000%. The Great Plains were especially well suited to this. Those wide flat lands were ideal for gas-driven tractors and plows and combines. The farmers also employed a one-way disc, which could quickly break the soil, uproot weeds. But with its spinning blades, it would pulverize the sod and would leave a layer of loose sediment over the ground, which years later would invite wind erosion and dust bowls in the following decades. Maybe we can draw a connection here. Turns out, too, that within a few years, Europeans' agricultural yields approached their pre-war levels after the end of the war. Fields recovered much faster than expected, which distorted the agricultural commodities markets. What that meant in the U.S. was that those artificial grain prices plummeted over 50% between 1920 and 1921, which created serious liquidity problems for those indebted farmers. So foreclosure rates reached record highs, numbers that we still haven't seen since. It's a combination of drought and the evaporation of European demand for American produce that left hundreds of thousands destitute. All belligerent societies attempted to increase agricultural output, so there are new government agencies that were created that instituted campaigns of home gardening and conservation on the home front. For example, in Germany, there are desperate efforts that lead to the plowing up of churchyards, of school grounds, and even beloved soccer fields. Here in the U.S., There was the creation of the National Ward Garden Commission, led by this man, Charles Lathrop Pack, who approached it with a single-minded sense of urgency, as you get from this little propaganda piece here, calling everyone to action. He encouraged the cultivation of gardens on every inch of tillable soil. This meant backyards, vacant lots, city parks, school grounds. Like we see here, this is what the youngsters could do during recess, right? Plant vegetables. We see it too in a city, so there's a re-ruralization of the city that seems to be taking place here. And we know here in the US that the wars really struck home when they start plowing up the Little League fields, like we see here, those darn Germans. By the end of the war, over 25% of American households had what were popularly called war gardens. This one's just fantastic, right? You have vegetables charging over the top. Or this one too. Will you have a part in victory? The last place I'll take you to today is Latin America. When the United States entered the war against Germany in 1917, several Latin American countries followed suit. Others stayed out of the war, but severed diplomatic ties with Germany, and some stayed neutral. And it's the neutral countries that I'll focus on. The principal neutrals were Argentina, Chile, and Mexico. Out of Mexico, we see it's coming oil that is fueling British ships. Chile is the world's leading exporter of the nitrogen used for fertilizer. But it's Argentina that's providing the bulk of the food. Argentina became a leading exporter of beef and mutton. It has what a lot of economists called a food-rich export economy or a dependent economy on European demand. For the British domestic meat consumption, it was imports that supplied over 40% of that. 80% of that trade came from Argentina. So this is what's driving environmental change on the Pampas, that vast fertile space that you see there. But with the First World War, there were changes in freezing technology that transformed social relations on the Pampas. It turns out that for freezing meat, the better meat is that it's the leaner meat. The marginal cattle, who maybe wouldn't have been great for that ribeye that you wanted, but were really suitable for freezing. So that meant that demand for that carefully bred, high-fat, quality heifer meant that those wealthy Argentinians who had invested extravagant sums into improving their herds received a pretty disappointing return on their investments. It was the poorer ranchers who were raising inferior cows that enjoyed the financial windfall. Midway through the war, the Entente powers were receiving the majority of their meat imports, their protein needs, from Argentina. We can think of this as a transatlantic energy exchange because the British were providing Argentina with coal. What that means is that the war directed and reinforced and at times balanced what were really mutually dependent energy networks between the two across the Atlantic. The last place I'll take you to is Cuba. When the United States declared war, so too did Cuba. Cuba also participated in this transatlantic energy exchange. Now, despite its favorable climate and pretty fertile soil, Cuba was actually a heavy importer of food stuff, mostly from the United States. In Cuba, they grew cash crops instead, mostly sugar and tobacco. Sugar and tobacco exports were the mainstays in the Cuban economy. So when war was declared, the United States directed its food production to its own armies. There was a flurry of government activity there in Cuba as authorities attempted to solve what they saw as an impending food crisis. So they're attempting things like fixing prices. Government representatives are approaching the owners of the great sugar plantations. They were called sugar centrals, encouraging to persuade their tenant farmers, the colonos, to plant food crops. There's the establishment of war farms in Cuba, agricultural zones that come under the direct supervision of the government. None of it, though, seemed very effective. We get a sense of that when in Christmas 1917, the government issues this rather paternalistic proclamation urging Cubans to eat less, to consume less bread, sugar, meat, and instead eat more bananas and beans, please. Most of the approaches to increasing food production proved ineffective. This is largely because sugar won more allegiances over vegetables. Sugarcane plantations meant wealth. But for many of the impoverished Cubans, they also signified foreign hegemony over sugar production. Of the some 130 sugar centrals on the islands, Americans owned 67 of them compared to the 18 Cuban owners. When the war broke out in Europe, the European sugar beet market plummeted, which meant that it raised sugar prices for Cuban sugarcane, which is driving plantation expansion. Caring little for these political disagreements, impoverished peasants expressed their frustration and their anti-Americanism by attacking these large sugar centrals. Fearing that German agents might recruit these insurgents, but really because they're more concerned about this valuable cash crop, the United States deploys Marines to calm the Cuban countryside and protect the plantations in 1917. Their presence there fuels anti-Americanism, but that year the sugar centrals brought in a record harvest. Here we go. This is Kurt Leuven I had introduced the talk with. This is a quick snippet from his work, Landscapes of War. Having served on the Western Front, Leuven knew a war landscape when he saw one. And as he suggests here in this quotation, these places need not be under fire. Even terrain free from trenches could be danger zones. So perceptions mattered, and for Leuven, belligerency was in the eye of the beholder. So as we look to the war's periphery, we find that forced labor, tsetse threats, and violent strikes and insurgencies all constituted a belligerent and violent environment. Social ruptures, economic upheaval, ecological dislocations from colonialism, industrialized mining, expansive agriculture added to a sense of anxiety that came with occupying a war landscape. Crossing these landscapes created unease in other, less obvious ways. The war simultaneously opened and closed frontiers. States expanded all along the ecological edges of the conflict. Some of these efforts were linked to empire-building projects, while others were part of capitalist schemes. All of them extended state control over the natural world in some way. On the ecological edges, then, of the war, we find that subjugated environments often meant marginalized people alienated from their land. Perhaps this is the Great War's global legacy. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to take any questions or comments if you have.
How conscious were people at the time of this being an environmental catastrophe as well as a military and human catastrophe? What you're doing is taking the tools of an environmental story and applying them back, and that's appropriate. But I'm wondering whether or not there was any consciousness at all. Levin seems to be more concerned with soldiers and fronts rather than with nature.
Yes.
But there were, I mean, when you think of the national park, there was already some ecological consciousness available to people. This is when the national parks were getting founded, et cetera. Yes. So I'm wondering whether or not there was a response at the time, even if it was ineffective, that suggested an awareness of the problem that you laid out so well today.
There was. And by way of example, I'll point out Germany to you, which was constrained and cut off from the markets But here we see a pretty, at least a longer history of conservation mindedness, these kind of organized efforts than we see elsewhere. And here the war afforded these conservationists an opportunity of legitimacy, that they could become involved in government decisions and what they saw as being crucial as the way to both protect, preserve, that means managing carefully these natural resources. So there was an awareness in some circles that this was both a catastrophe, but also something that could be remedied with state intervention. I dazzled you.
I'll ask.
Oh, please go ahead.
Thanks for a great talk. You emphasize the recovery of the landscape, and could you talk a little bit about, I mean, you didn't talk, I don't think, specifically about the recovery of the African countryside.
Right.
So, I mean, is there any recovery there that is all analogous? Because it seems to be implicitly your argument is that the landscape of the western part recovers, but elsewhere the effects are long-lasting into the present. And I wonder if that's your argument, and if so, whether or not there is any recovery comparable to what happens in the western part.
Yeah, in some places there are, but what this war then afforded a lot of those colonial powers was the opportunity to expand that infrastructure that they had been finding for years, and then the war had given the armies that incentive and the manpower to be able to do that. In some places, and it's also from a certain point of view. If we were to take the point of view of the Tsetse, then the war was a wonderful thing because it expanded all kinds of land and territory for it. And the same might be true for other forms of wildlife. So we might think of it less as a recovery, as more of a shifting that's then taking place on where we find pockets of population, and as people are moving in response to these shifting disease zones. So in some places we find a recovery, in a sense, at least of the bush returning back from human intervention, and in other places we find the solidification of the human footprint that's there.
I had an experience after World War II. I toured with my dad in eastern France and Belgium, and in more of the lowland areas where crops had been there. But now, in 1956 and 57, when we did that when I was a boy, all of these lands were closed because of mines. They had barbed wire fence up, and the farmers just disappeared because their lands had been mined and had never been cleared.
That's true today.
9 or 10 years after the war had ended.
No, that's true still today. We have still the red zones there where we have deminers, as they're called. We're going through and digging up these remnants of war, some of which are making their way back to the surface. Every year farmers have what they call an iron harvest, where they uncover this stuff. Some of them in these territories will have specially built armored tractors underneath, because we still get casualties from it. From that perspective, the war is still going on. Another approach that we can take to that is we have these red zones, which in a lot of ways make for really wonderful nature reserves, right, that are preventing any sort of human intervention. So these weapons that had once wrecked the land are now protecting it in that way. There's just, different ways that we can think about, how the war affects these landscapes.
That was sort of where I was going. Were there positive environmental impacts? I mean, the demand for food, were there new agricultural techniques that were more efficient, more effective, less disruptive to the environment? You talked about were people displaced? Perhaps people weren't living in the most habitable or places where there were better use for that land. Maybe it was better used as farmland, and they were forced to go into the mountains.
That's true. That's true. I should have been a little more careful with that, because there were, in fact, a lot of positive. We might think of them as positive environmental impacts that are coming out of this, in a sense, where it's decreasing demand in certain sectors. We see this particularly with the fish populations. When German submarines were making their ways into the Atlantic and fishermen were then hesitant to go out after the salmon, right? So salmon populations boom. We find this especially in the American South. In a lot of ways, those German submarines were saviors of the American southern forests, which were suffering severe deforestation due to lumber demands to fuel the war. And when those submarines cut down on trade, reducing those prices, those forests were able to recover to some small degree. So yeah, there's a lot of give and take. It's not just a one-directional environmental impact.
Thank you for your talk. I just was thinking also about some of the war poetry that talks about the reversal of human relationships to Earth or to the land and what humans occupy, so that and there are comparisons between soldiers as vermin,
Yeah,
say,
that's right.
rats as worms,
As animals.
and
Yeah.
then rats as, I think there's a poem by Rosenberg where he talks about a rat with cosmopolitan sympathies because he can cross no man's land, but
That's right.
the humans are underground in the earth
Yeah.
with the lice.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. This comes up in Junger's writings. Ernst Junger talks about this in a lot of his writings, where soldiers, when they're looking out, will see pheasant there in the undergrowth or rabbits there in the undergrowth, which seem to be doing just fine. In fact, Junger had a great thing to say about little songbirds. He was impressed and amazed that they would not only survive the shelling, but seem to revel in it, singing as if nothing were happening, which was really disjointing for a lot of these guys there in the trenches.
So forgive me, I came in late to your talk. You may have mentioned this before I arrived, but it's my understanding that the British fleet converted from coal to oil.
That's right.
And so, of course, there was a great deal of interest in Mesopotamia.
Yes.
And development of oil fields there.
That's right.
And I was wondering if this is not farming, obviously, but it is resource development.
That's right.
Whether your work has taken you there, what you have to say about that?
It has, because I look at food and fuel as well. In fact, it's interesting. Yes, around 1912 is when the British fleet began converting from coal-fired to oil-driven. The same day that Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo, the illustrious port in Istanbul issued a concession to a jointly owned British-German oil firm for potential oil exploration in the vilayets of Baghdad, Basel, and Mazar. So we can, those things, automatically those names should ring bells for us. There's a reason why the British were so keen on controlling that territory, even though it wasn't very desirable at that time. There wasn't any oil exploration in what became Iraq until well after the war. But the British were sure sending troops there to guard it under pretty terrible conditions. The troops there were facing these awful sand conditions and diseases. The British troops would write about something they called the Baghdad boils. I have no idea what it is, but it sounds horrible. But there's incentives there to control these fuel resources that are certainly going to shape the geopolitics after the war. Yeah, thanks for that.
Well, if there are no more questions, could you please join me in thanking